So, friends, at his recent speech to Congress, did you see Donald Trump thank Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts and tell him that he, Donald Trump, won't forget it? He won't forget what Roberts did for him? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, here's an easy question. What is the most important, the most beneficial thing Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts did for Donald Trump? He authored a Supreme Court opinion saying that Donald Trump has absolute immunity. He can commit all the crimes he wants against the American people, and he can't be prosecuted for those crimes. As long as the Supreme Court believes those crimes were part of Donald Trump exercising his core constitutional functions. Can't be prosecuted for his crimes. That's a pretty big effing deal, right? John Roberts made Donald Trump not a superhero, but a supervillain who can get away with his crimes. Roberts didn't bestow on Donald Trump the power to fly or the power of invisibility. He bestowed on Donald Trump the power of lawlessness. And after that, there is no disputing chronologically after the Supreme Court, as headed up by John Roberts, gave Donald Trump the power of lawlessness, Donald Trump said to Roberts, thank you, won't forget it. So the question we're going to tackle, friends, is can the Supreme Court revisit and revoke presidential immunity? Before we turn to that question, let's start with the new reporting. This from the Daily Beast. Headline, Trump thanks Chief Supreme Court Justice on hot mic, won't forget it. And that article begins, Donald Trump thanked Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts and added that he won't forget it after delivering a speech to Congress Tuesday night. Quote, thank you again, won't forget it, he, Trump, said, shaking Roberts' hand and then tapping the George W. Bush appointee on the arm. It was not immediately clear what exactly Trump was thanking him for, though there have been more than a few instances over the past few years of Supreme Court intervention in favor of the president. And friends, as we were just discussing, last year, Roberts authored a decision granting former presidents sweeping immunity from prosecution, in effect helping Trump avoid facing trial for trying to overturn the 2020 election. He had been indicted for offenses relating to his alleged election subversion in Washington, D.C. and in Georgia. Another case that the conservative majority court decided in Trump's favor last year was allowing him to be kept on the ballot after some states pointed to the 14th Amendment's ban on insurrectionists from holding federal office. And in another January 6 related case, Roberts wrote for the court that obstruction charges against January 6 defendants had to be narrower than the prosecutors had brought. Trump's D.C. case included 2 obstruction charges. Later on Wednesday night, the president took to Truth Social to offer up an explanation for his gratitude. Quote, the fake play the ref news in order to create a divide between me and our great U.S. Supreme Court heard me say last night loudly and openly as I was walking past the justices on the way to the podium, thank you to Chief Justice John Roberts, Trump wrote, quote, like most people, I don't watch fake news, CNN or MSDNC, but I understand that they're going crazy asking, "What is it that I was thanking Justice Roberts for?" Trump claimed neither outlet called my office to ask, but said, "If they had, I would have told these sleazebag journalists that I thanked him for swearing me in on Inauguration Day and doing a really good job in doing so!" Exclamation point. Friends, is there anybody who believes that absurd, ridiculous, nonsensical explanation by Donald Trump for why he said, "Thank you, I won't forget it"? Anybody believe that? Anybody? No, I didn't think so. Look at it this way. Okay, Chief Justice John Roberts did do at least two things for Donald Trump. He bestowed upon him the supervillain power of lawlessness, and he administered the oath on Inauguration Day. And Donald Trump claims that the reason he said, thank you, won't forget it, is because Roberts swore him in on January 20th, not because Roberts bestowed upon him the democracy-busting power of lawlessness? Excuse me. Bullshit. Oh, sorry. Okay, friends, let's tackle a quick thought experiment. Can the Supreme Court revisit and revoke presidential immunity? The only accurate answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. From time to time, the Supreme Court reverses itself. They revisit an old case, an old ruling, old precedent, and they reverse that earlier precedent. We don't see it happen often, but it does happen. And usually, friends, when it happens, the new Supreme Court opinion that emerges, reversing an old Supreme Court opinion, usually is designed to make America a better, more fair, more equal place. Like when the Supreme Court finally overturned the horrific precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember that? Separate but equal, government-sponsored, government-endorsed racial discrimination, racial segregation. They finally put a nail in the coffin of Plessy versus Ferguson with the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. But of course, sometimes, and more recently, the Supreme Court cruelly revokes, changes course, overrules old precedent, like it did recently in the Dobbs case, revoking women's constitutional rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. But either way, the answer is yes, of course the Supreme Court can change course, can overrule earlier Supreme Court precedents. So the next question becomes, well, will the Supreme Court have a vehicle and a reason to revisit presidential immunity? And the answer is they might very well have both a vehicle, a case, and a reason to revisit the horrific democracy-busting opinion granting presidents the power of lawlessness. Okay, friends, here we go. Hypothetical. Donald Trump continues to violate federal court orders. Frankly, there is reporting out there that Trump and his administration are already in violation of multiple court orders, but let's assume that Donald Trump continues to defy, to violate, to thumb his nose at federal court orders. Let's assume that Donald Trump is thereafter found to be in criminal contempt and he is convicted. He will appeal that conviction, and guess where the appeal will end up? In the Supreme Court. And guess what the issue on appeal will be? Presidential immunity. And friends, it could very well be that if in the coming weeks and months Donald Trump and his cabinet flunkies continue to violate federal court orders, well, the Supreme Court might just want to revisit and consider revoking the absurd power of presidential immunity. And you might be saying to yourself, Glenn, well, you kind of rushed through one part. How in the world will Donald Trump ever be prosecuted for anything, including contempt of court orders, because it is Donald Trump's dirty DOJ that now holds all the prosecutorial cards? They're not going to bring contempt charges against Donald Trump for intentionally, repeatedly violating federal court orders. Well, friends, it turns out the rule of law actually has a fix for that problem. And it's a fix that doesn't involve the need for the Department of Justice to bring charges when somebody defies, violates a lawful federal court order. Remember how there was a brief filed in recent days in the Mayor Eric Adams case in New York? I'm not going to recap the whole thing, but the presiding judge, Judge Dale Ho, ordered an outside attorney to come in and argue whether Adams' case should be dismissed, whether DOJ should be allowed to dismiss it temporarily and hold it over Adams' head. And the outside counsel, Paul Clement, former Solicitor General who's argued more than 100 cases before the Supreme Court, filed a brief in recent days, first of all, rejecting DOJ's attempt to temporarily dismiss Eric Adams' case so they can use it as leverage later. But he also dropped right in the middle of a 33-page pleading something that directly addresses the issue we are discussing. What happens if Trump continues to violate court orders and the court wants to uphold its own rules, its own lawfully issued orders, and hold him in contempt, but DOJ won't do it, won't prosecute, won't bring a charge, won't apply the rule of law as it is supposed to be applied under these circumstances? Here is what Paul Clement in the brief said about that. He first notes that, although there's no express authorization for courts to take over a prosecution or appoint a special prosecutor that DOJ wishes to abandon, there is one narrow context in which the Supreme Court has recognized that a court has authority to exercise what would otherwise be a core executive function. It is long settled that courts possess inherent authority to initiate contempt proceedings for disobedience to their orders, authority which necessarily encompasses the ability to appoint a private attorney to prosecute the contempt, I'll fill in the blank there, when DOJ won't prosecute. The brief continues. The Supreme Court has upheld it being the power of the court to appoint an outside prosecutor in a contempt case. The Supreme Court has upheld it as essential to ensuring that the judiciary has a means to vindicate its own authority without complete dependence on other branches, on the executive branch, the DOJ. As Young explained, Young is precedent, if the judiciary were completely dependent on the executive branch, DOJ, to redress direct affronts to its authority, it would be powerless to protect itself if that branch, DOJ, declined prosecution. So friends, that concludes today's thought experiment. And the answer to our hypothetical question is yes, there is a way the Supreme Court could be in a position to revisit the horrific democracy-busting precedent of presidential immunity, the presidential power of lawlessness. The answer is yes. Now, to be clear, I'm not asserting it's likely to happen, but I will say that with each court order that Donald Trump defies, violates, thumbs his nose at, I think it becomes more likely, not less likely, that the Supreme Court will find itself not just wanting, but needing to revisit the concept of presidential immunity. And I, for one, sure as hell hope they get there. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.